Okay, guys, we have a very special message and special speaker today, day before Good Friday. Our speaker today is Dr. Scott Wieters, and Dr. Wieters is a 2001 graduate of the medical school here at UTHSCSA. He is now an emergency medicine director at Scott & White, clerkship director of the emergency medicine program, and assistant professor there. And he and his wife Jody have been married for 14 years, and they have 4 children, 4 beautiful children. Are we going to see pictures? Probably not. No pictures this time, but ask him afterwards maybe. And Jody is also a physician in emergency medicine there at Scott & White. So please welcome with me Dr. Scott Wieters.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. Okay, thank you so much for letting me come share some time with you this morning. San Antonio's got a real tender spot in my heart. It was not too far from here. I grew up on a farm. My parents actually came out today to come participate. And, you know, through my life, God had pursued me in a number of ways. Through my family, community, school. And then finally, it took a while because of my hard headedness to chase me down and catch me. He really found me in College Station as nearly a senior at Texas A&M. And it was there that he really brought me to my knees in repentance. And I began to understand the gospel. Quickly thereafter, I was thrust into this room as a medical student. And I sat kind of right over here in this area. Some things have changed. Looks like we have new chairs, thank God. But I had my expectations for medical school. I mean, who wouldn't, right? You're going to medical school, you think, gosh, this is where I'm going to find the answers to life. I'm going to know why I'm here. I'm going to know what life's about. I'm going to find out what I should be doing. Respond. And it did answer a lot of those. I see some of my professors here today, and going around the place looking at things. Some things are old, some things are new. But medicine could not answer all the questions in my life, and I was horribly disappointed when I found that it couldn't. But I was also amazingly impressed that he also allowed a godly roommate in a ministry like CMDA and 4 guys that are probably some of my closest friends that helped me get through that difficult time in medical school. And so I had to look away from the traditional medical model because I knew it couldn't answer these questions for me, but I found them in other ways. And I'm going to come back to that story a little later, but what I'd like to do now is do a discussion about the medical and physiologic processes that Christ went through on the cross. So I'm going to use the medical model that I was taught, the scientific method, to explain these things, and then we'll come back to my earlier comments. A lot of distressing videos here. I will say that our story starts and the garden gets ended. Christ had just finished his Last Supper with his closest friends. And then he went to the garden. Judas was there. He took the money. Betrayed Jesus, gave him his kiss. At that point, you can imagine Jesus being very emotional about things. Guilt-stricken, scared, fearful. It's one thing to know something bad might happen to you, but be unaware of exactly how it will happen. It's another thing completely to know exactly how you will die and exactly how it will take place. And this was very distressing for anyone going through that, and uniquely for Christ. So, here in the Gospel of Luke, being in agony, praying earnestly, and all of a sudden sweat became like giant drops of blood falling down to the ground. So he gives us a account of his sweat turning to blood, and you read that and you think, well, gosh, that doesn't happen. What's that about? But this actually is a true medical condition. Hematohydrosis, blood, hydrosis, sweat. It is a rare but entity that exists. And so we do find this happening. And there's a few different examples of how this would happen. There's a few cases that we'll talk about. So the reason this happens is, if you remember a cross-section through the skin, here's a caricature, we do know that there's a lot of different things in our sweat glands, and there's still like capillaries and things like that. Whenever we have such high levels of sympathetic tone, the basement membrane starts to break down. The capillaries start to bleed. The barrier between the sweat glands and the small blood vessels start to dissipate, and all of a sudden mixing takes place. Usually it's a time of intense fear. This is a photo of a young gentleman experiencing this rare condition. And it's been experienced by other people. It was documented in 6 people that were condemned to death by execution. So that's been a case report. Also bombing in London during the Blitz. Case reports came out of that situation from the intense fear of bombs being dropped around you. Hematohydrosis ensued. Fear sailing through a storm is another example. All of these are accounts of people having hematohydrosis. And Jesus' sweat became like tears. And blood came forth. So, Jesus is taken from this place. He's roughened up a little bit. He then goes through a series of marches around the area. He first goes from Gethsemane to Ananias. Then to Caiaphas, he goes to the Sanhedrin. He faces Pilate. Then to Herod, then back to Pilate, and is scourged to this point. So this whole time, Jesus is being beaten. He's being pushed on the ground. Jerusalem is a very heavy, hilly place, so he's going up and down hills. He's probably not been given much nutrition and water up to this point after he's been captured and treated like a pretty rough prisoner. And he walks about 2.5 miles in sandals. He doesn't have great running shoes. Next, I want to talk about the aspect of scourging. Okay, Jesus was next taken and treated by professionals, Roman professionals. The Roman professionals' job in that day to scourge people was not to kill them, but to bring them as close to the brink of death as you could, maintaining them to still be alive. And they were experts at this. He gave his back to those who beat him. Plucked my face. I didn't shield from the buffets and the spitting, Jesus says. It's predicted in Isaiah all these things would happen, and it sure enough did. The actual aspect of scourging someone was a pretty rough deal. We tie the victim up, their hands at a distance to where they couldn't escape. Nowhere to go, you couldn't squirm or move. Then they would take a large stick, they would attach some leather straps to it. At that point, when you would move it forth, you can increase the centripetal force of that distant object. And attaching things like metal beads and bones and pieces of glass and sharp objects would add some weight to that. If you look at the speed of someone throwing a fastball, it comes in about probably 70 miles an hour, unless you're a major leaguer. But if you attach another distance to that fulcrum, and then you swing it forth, the distance incurred by that, as we all know physics, will increase the speeds of those projectiles probably in the hundreds of miles an hour. They come slamming down the back of the victim and then ripped apart, ensuing damage with both blunt force trauma as well as penetrating trauma and lacerations. The words in Latin actually mean to flay the flesh when we talk about the word scourge. This is a patient that I had of my own who was riding a motorcycle through a Texas hill country ride. He ran across a barbed wire fence. And immediately when I saw his injuries, I thought, oh my gosh, this has got to be somewhat similar to what Christ experienced, just looked like that. It took us hours to scrub all the dirt away. I had a team of about 5 medical students and residents that sewed this guy up over a few hours, but you can imagine the pain involved in something like that. We also know that the back has a very thick epidermal layer. We talk about the epidermal layers from the back of our hand and some of our anterior surfaces. We notice that the skin's not quite that thick. When we look at the back, we see in this biopsy here, we see how thick the back of the skin is. And so there's actually a lot of protection there. And it's probably most efficient to inflict the most pain when you will enter the back, because you're going to be getting deep into the structures, but you're not going to be harming any vital organs inside in any serious fashion. Just as there are many who are bald and his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man in his form, marred beyond any human likeness. Talks about it in the book of Isaiah, and that's what happened to Christ next. Again, the scourging was meant to bring him right at the brink of death, but not yet go over. So they weaken the victim. Scourging that day was meant to inflict the most pain for the most benefit, the most torture, unlike the way we deal with people today in our modern civilized society. At this point, we can make some conclusions about how Christ is feeling. At this point, he's got severe mental anguish. We talked about the fact that he is having blood come from his sweat. We can talk about acute dehydration. He's not been given any water now. It's almost probably 12 to 14 hours after he's had anything. He's also got acute severe blood loss. Certainly after receiving multiple lacerations across your back, slowly bleeding, he's probably at a state right now of a little bit of hypovolemic shock. Obviously, he's incurring acute severe pain and probably didn't sleep well the night before. And this is the physiology that we find Christ in at this point in the narrative. Next, we talk about attaching the victim to the cross. In this day and age, it's well known about how people were attached to the cross, and I think we can look back and talk about some anatomy and also some of the historical records and make some conclusions. This might have been a cross T pattern, or it might have been a true crucifix that Jesus was attached to. But what they would do in that day is they would attach a large timber across the patibulum. That was the horizontal piece. The victim usually had this tied to his hands and was expected to carry this from the point of scourging up to the point of crucifixion. We know from records that this piece of timber probably weighed anywhere from about 75 to 125 pounds. So if you can imagine, after being tortured and weakened and not sleeping the night before, attaching a 100-pound timber to your back and expecting you to walk through town. Clearly this did not go well. Christ had stumbled, he had fell. He had assistance by people lifting this and carrying him to his death. I want you to notice right now in this video where they're placing the spike. It's placed right in the mid-palm. This is the Passion of Christ. You've probably seen this. It's very gruesome. But a lot of people will associate the placement of the spike in the hand with the mid-palm. But I think when we look back at the anatomy and we think about what went on, for Roman soldiers to be experts in this and professionals, they were students of the crucifixion. If you attach that peg to the middle of our hand, in between the metacarpal bones, surely it would rip out with any man's weight. That is not a good place to place a spike. The victim would surely fall through and would not accomplish the goal for which it was intended. If we take a cross-section, we look through the wrist, we would probably better conclude that this spike was placed through the middle carpal bones within the wrist, even maybe more proximal in between the radius and the ulna, so that there would be plenty of ligamentous force to withstand the holding of this arm to the cross. You'll also notice that this hand is held in a little bit of a paralyzed fashion, in which the thumb, the index finger, and the long finger are usually extended. However, the ring finger and the pinky are able to be moved. Many people think that this was placed through the median nerve, which is the nerve which travels on the volar aspect, or the anterior part of our wrist, and crosses underneath the fibrous layer, and then provides innervation for the long index and thumb finger. That's what you get when you have carpal tunnel, if you remember. So this spike might have gone through that. Now, historically speaking, he would have had severe pain in that distribution, there's no doubt, because the nerve would have either been transected, or abraded, or lacerated, or somehow bruised and injured. Would have caused severe pain, obviously. However, when you look at modern art, and you pay careful attention to that, looking at this picture, the position of Christ's finger is with his long finger and index finger and thumb open, which is the median nerve sensory distribution. It almost would seem that these are paralyzed. However, knowing anatomy, knowing physiology, we know through anatomy, Dr. Richards told this, you look at the anterior compartment of your wrist and your forearm. The muscles that innervate those come from nerves that are back in the forearm, not back in the wrist. You have very few muscles in your hand. The muscles that cause you to grasp are all back in the forearm. Jesus would have had the ability to move his hand. Popular culture and paintings and historical cinematography is incorrect in my assessment. He would have been able to move those muscles because they're more proximal and further up in the arm. But he would have had pain everywhere from that nerve on out to his hand. So we can take away a few notes there. Now the feet, again, the victim's feet were probably nailed to the cross, and in this situation they could probably go a little bit further down in between the metatarsal bones of our midfoot. And so I think this is probably a very realistic location for this to be placed. If you would have gone further up into between the tibia and the fibula, again, it might have stretched between that syndesmotic ligament and caused problems. So I think the placement of this nail historically speaking, and also from a medical perspective, is probably accurate. I think we can trust that. Now, in the foot, you would have had experienced severe pain through that plantar nerve that it probably would intersect with. You'll notice also the placement of this nail would not involve any of the two main arteries coming through the foot, the dorsalis pedis and the posterior tibialis. It would have missed those. We've got an arch of those two arteries meeting in the midfoot, and they would have missed that on purpose. Also within the hand. That's the other reason I don't think they put the nail right there in the arch of the arteries from the radial and the ulnar nerves, which are on the sides. They would have gone in the middle, more proximal, to avoid arterial bleeding. Again, they wanted to inflict pain, they wanted to make punishment, but they did not want to kill the person just yet. I think one of the most amazing things when doing the research for this talk that I found was the physiology of respiration. And you got to go with me here. This might be over some heads, but go with me on this. If I'm going to take a breath in, it is an active form of movement of my muscles. I must breathe in. I'm extending my shoulders. I'm pulling them up. I'm using my intercostal muscles to expand my ribs. I'm pulling with all of my strap muscles in my neck, my sternocleidomastoid, my trapezius. All of these muscles are causing me to inspire. It's an active form of breathing. When I relax, I naturally expire. You don't have to force yourself to expire. It's a reluctant, passive phase of breathing. However, in physiology of crucifixion, the active form of respiration is no longer inspiration or breathing in, it's expiration, breathing out. When Jesus is holding the cross by his arms, all of the muscles that we actively inspire are stretched to their capacity. His rib cage is opened up. All of his respiratory muscles are pulling his rib cage open, and now he passively breathes in. If he wants to breathe out, it now becomes an active form of labor and work to actually breathe out. When he relaxes, he's open. His lungs are fully inflated. He must pull himself up by the arms, push himself up by the feet, and collapse his chest in order to breathe out. Metabolically, the first years in the class? No first year medical students? So we got some, my people. So, if we're to look at the Krebs cycle, okay, we can do aerobic metabolism very well. Okay, when you get oxygen coming in, we can go ahead and we can take this stuff and get down the Krebs cycle and make a bunch of energy, right? But if I put you on a treadmill or I put you on a bike and I tell you to run and I tell you to go, you'll reach a point to which you cannot get enough oxygen to your tissues. And then you will have to switch in to doing aerobic metabolism. I'm sorry, not aerobic, but anaerobic, without oxygen metabolism. It's less efficient. The byproduct is lactate, and we get lactic acid formation. This is the same physiology that people have when they're dying of severe sepsis or they're having acute blood loss and they're not able to function. These are the things that happen to people. And in Christ's situation here, from severe dehydration and acute blood loss, without inability to take in fluids, without care, without stopping the bleeding, he's going through this process and having significant lactic acidosis using anaerobic metabolism. So Jesus has two things happen to him. He cannot breathe out. He is impaired by breathing out. The carbon dioxide, because of his hypoventilation, builds up in his bloodstream. And the carbon dioxide builds, and it builds, and it builds. And finally, it pushes over, causing CO2 retention, and then shifting the current over to produce acid. In concert with that, I just talked about the lactic acidosis that Christ suffered from. He's also now probably in renal failure. He's got lactic acidosis, poor perfusion to his tissue, acid building up in the bloodstream. So this is the rare situation when we have both a metabolic and a respiratory acidosis. I cannot find another situation that I've been looking for that can combine these two rare entities. But it's my theory and hypothesis that Jesus suffered from both of these rare clinical entities. As you know, the symptoms of acidosis are horrible. It affects central, respiratory, heart, muscular, intestinal, gastric, and he would be experiencing the full force of all of these things as they affect his body. At this point, Jesus is in a distributed form of shock. At this point, if we were to look at his vital signs, we would see that he would be tachycardic. His heart rate would be up in the 120s, 130s, 140s. His blood pressure at this point would be dropping down in the 90s, the 80s, as he continued to poorly perfuse his tissues. If we were to put in a central line at this point and measure the pressures of the heart right before the blood entered into the heart, our inferior and superior vena cava pressures, our central venous pressures, we would find them significantly decreased, even though we're having vasoconstriction by all of our peripheral vessels to try and get that pressure pushed to the heart, shift to the vital organs. Our CVP would be very low. Again, the peripheral vascular resistance of all of our arteries and veins are clamping down, trying to reserve any last volume of blood, constricting the extremities, constricting areas that don't need blood flow, and concentrating into the heart, the brain, the lungs, the kidneys. His cardiac output, Jesus' heart at this stage, is pounding. Harder, faster, harder, faster, as much as he can. The next step in Jesus' physiology as he's being crucified is he's going through something called multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. Basically, all of your organs begin to fail. It's one of the last pathways from shock. Liver failure would ensue, bowel integrity would be lost, and transmission of toxins across the bowel wall would ensue. We're also going to see things like acute lung injury. The permeability of the blood in the lungs would cause acute lung injury to ensue. He'd also start to have cerebral edema. Confusion and delirium would set in place, and there would be an anguish and a suffering that he would feel. He would go into acute kidney injury and acute kidney failure. And these are the things that we would expect at this stage. When Jesus received the sour wine, he said that it's finished. He bowed and gave up his spirit. We teach the 10 reasons why people die. Especially in emergency medicine, we know them the 5 H's and the 5 T's. If you're to classify why people ultimately end up dying, it's because of one of these 10 reasons. And as doctors, you're going to try to stop this. As health professionals, you're going to try to recognize this and treat this. Looking at Christ's case, I think we can come to the conclusion that he probably suffered from 4, maybe even 5 of these. He had hypoxia from not being able to breathe well. He had hyperkalemia in my assessment because of his renal failure. Kidneys distribute out and balance our electrolytes. Going into failure would cause hyperkalemia, and you probably had a sense of this. We talk about acidosis, from the hydrogen ions, from his lactic acidosis as well as his respiratory acidosis. And of course, hypovolemia, no volume of blood, no fluids. He's bleeding to death. And these would all contribute to Christ's death. If we were to attach a cardiac monitor to Jesus, we would see he would be in sinus tachycardia that would then slow into a widened pulseless electrical activity rhythm. And then finally, a systole, a flap. Interesting historical comments include in the Gospels that it was predicted in Psalms, but also included in the Gospels that he keeps all of his bones, and not one of them is broken. In the Gospel of John, it talks about when they came to Jesus and saw that he was dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. And something interesting happens next. The historical account is that blood and fluid came out. And I think early historians and people that aren't medically minded might look at that and say, well, that's kind of weird. Why would blood and water come out of somebody? I can see blood, but why water come out of somebody? At this time, the Roman soldier is beneath Jesus and has probably a 10-foot to 8-foot long spear. Jesus is probably, his feet are about 5 feet off the ground. He's probably maybe 10 feet off the ground with his entire head. And so this Roman soldier is reaching up with his spear in order to pierce the side of Jesus to ensure his death. You see, Roman soldiers were not allowed to put someone on a cross that would come down alive. They knew the consequences for that were death. They were experts and professionals at what they did. This spear probably came up in the either right or left upper quadrant, might have gone through the thoracic cavity as well as the pericardial cavity, perhaps. Maybe in that day, Jesus might have had a pleural effusion or a collection of fluid within the lung cavity. That's certainly seen in many patients who have undergone blunt trauma and then also injury to the chest cavity. If we were to do an x-ray, we might expect to see something like this with a collection of fluid perhaps in the lung. And maybe that was the fluid that came out. Maybe there was a collection of fluid around the pericardium. We know that happens. You can get a traumatic pericarditis and a pericardial effusion from these kind of things. So if we did a CAT scan, we might expect a stripe of fluid like this, or an ultrasound. We might expect to see the dark fluid from the pericardial fluid. Maybe this was abdominal fluid. Maybe from the blunt force trauma, he had a ascitic fluid, or a collection of the serum of our blood within the abdominal cavity. And maybe that spear pierced his side into his liver, and that would cause the fluid. In conclusion, I provided some theories, some hypotheses on the way that Jesus' anatomy and physiology reacted to his death. I'm not going to go through and explain and address all of the rebuttals to maybe Jesus was swooned off and resuscitated in the ER by his disciples and given blood and had an operation and was healed. I'm not going to address that. It's written immensely in other places. What I will do is I will tell you that when I was in medical school, I was frustrated with the medical process not being answered big questions in life. Medicine will answer some wonderful things for us. It will help us take better care of our patients. It will help us understand things better, and it's one way to look at reality. But medicine has limits. The scientific model that we trust for the foundation of our understanding of reality is not everything there is. And to talk about that, I might need to talk about what happens the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And 3 days later, finally, after Jesus has been taken down from the cross, he's been punished. He then is buried and undergoes receiving the sins of the whole world. There's not much written about that section of Scripture, but that might be where the maximal suffering took place, when he paid the price for us. Now, 3 days later, something else happened. Mary is looking for Jesus. So Mary, mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene are looking for Jesus. They went to the tomb, and there was a great earthquake. An angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, his clothes white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He's risen." I cannot use the traditional medical model to explain resurrection to you. You will become frustrated, you will become confused, and you will not be able to use that tool to answer things like resurrection. Because resurrection does not know the level or the language of love. Science cannot answer concepts like love. Resurrection can. Why would a man go and suffer through all of this for someone else? Why would suffering exist? Why would courage exist? You see, if we look for science, it cannot tell us why a poem or a painting may be beautiful. It can't tell us why a song may be inspiring. It knows not the currency of these things. You may not expect it. If we practice only understanding the scientific model, our practices will be uninterpretable. They'll be distressing, unsettling. We must look elsewhere to be amazing practitioners. We must look to things like the resurrection. We must look outside of science to understand the hope and the love and the peace and the patience and the kindness. And so it's through resurrection that I would challenge you to understand your training as a medical professional. Don't approach it looking through the single lens of the medical model. Have a wider view. Then you'll be able to see how wonderful and great and beautiful and robust life is. I send you away this Passion Week with that challenge. I put that stone in your shoe to walk away with. And I challenge you to take all that medicine is and look at it through the lens of resurrection. And there you will find how beautiful life can be.